There's this Pokemon mechanic that barely got any screen time when it was first introduced. However, over the past decade, this mechanic would become a staple in Pokemon's combat system. You could call me Nordis, and I've been making my own collection of creatures based off of STEM topics as I'm working on a project on Godot. But today, we'll go over this particular Pokemon mechanic that's been increasingly prevalent in the games, before briefly mentioning other games and what I'm planning to do in my project as I show off another one of my Zodiac Beast designs. So get ready to touch some grass, because today, we're talking about terrains. Actually, let's start this chapter by going further back. In Generation 2, there were 3 moves that can set the weather during the battle, where the weather would apply a certain set of rules on top of the regular combat system. Namely, Rain and Harsh Sunlight, buffing and debuffing water and fire moves, while Sandstorm chipped everyone's health except for Pokemon with certain types. However, the next generation would flesh out weathers not just as a battle mechanic by adding a new weather to offer symmetry with Sandstorm, but also by tying the main story and box legendaries to the phenomena, as the weather conditions in the overworld could affect the battles in the area and wild encounters. Additionally, the box legendaries have signature abilities that spawn a certain weather effect upon entry, and eventually several other Pokemon would have weather setting abilities as well, making weather-based teams a viable strat. But activating a weather overwrites the previous one, and thus the weather wars would ensue. But I already got a whole video talking about weather. What does it have to do with terrains? Well, by the 6th generation, Pokemon has been running a few years of competitive tournaments, and they must have noticed how popular this weather mechanic was, because now Pokemon made a sequel to weathers, terrains, which also apply their own set of rules while only allowing one terrain to be active at a time. However, terrains and weather conditions are allowed to exist simultaneously. It's just that the terrain's effects are only applied to Pokemon who are touching the ground. Alright, let's back it up. How wasn't this too confusing? Well, for starters, while weather and terrains can overlap, none of the effects directly hindered each other, as they largely dealt with different types. Like, you don't have to worry about the terrain when you're about to use a water move. Speaking of the types, the 3 terrains were Grassy, Electric, and Misty terrain, where the last one was associated with the new Fairy type. The first 2 boost their respective types' damage by 50% for now, but Misty terrain doesn't boost Fairy moves, but instead halves the damage done by Dragon moves. My personal theory is that this was to avoid the box legendaries from being too unbalanced with each other, because Xerneas and Yveltal have Fairy and Dark auras, which already boost their type's damage. Giving Xerneas a terrain that can further boost Fairy moves might be too unfair for Yveltal. But this does make Misty terrain a little more confusing, as many players expected a boost to their damage instead of debuffing dragons even further. Now, when the 3 weathers were introduced in Generation 2, I don't know if people were complaining, because the internet was barely a thing back then. But there was a clear pair between Rain and Harsh Sunlight, as they had inverse effects with each other, while the third was largely unrelated. So maybe that's just what's going on here. Terrains would have quite the rocky start, as their secondary effects start to get even more confusing. Grassy terrain heals everyone for a 16th of their health. Alright, so it's like the opposite of Sandstorm and Hail's damage. You're touching grass, so you're healing. Alright, so does the electric terrain do something similar? Nope. Electric terrain prevents everyone from sleeping and getting drowsy. That kinda came out of nowhere. But then Misty terrain prevents everyone from gaining a status condition which includes sleep. Now, one could probably perform enough mental gymnastics to justify these effects, as people have done so with type matchups anyways, but the issue here is that we don't see that much symmetry between the terrains, unlike with the weather conditions, so it's easy to forget which effects these terrains have. And whoops! I hope you didn't forget that these effects only apply when you're on the ground. Flying and levitating Pokemon won't be protected, nor would they get a boost due to the terrain. So at the end of the day, there are many players who just don't recognize what the terrains do. However, that's not just because the effects are hard to remember, but also because players rarely get to see these effects in the first place. Besides Clement's Magneton, none of the gym leaders and Elite Four in the XY games run terrains. And as far as I know, none of the overworld conditions automatically set terrains in this generation either. So why were these effects even made in the first place? Personally, I think it's because of the competitive scene. As mentioned earlier, Pokemon held official tournaments for a few years by now, so they got data on what strategies are dominating the scene, like the Weather Wars. But there are also other popular moves like Spore and Yawn, and now these could be directly blocked by electric terrain. Many attribute the addition of the fairy type to how dragons were OP in the previous games, as it grew from just having one special line having this super defensive and reliably offensive type into having several species with beefy stats wielding this element. So while the fairy type Pokemon were already immune and bodies dragons, they can set a misty terrain to further protect their partners from outrages and Draco Meteors, while also protecting them from Will-O-Wisp burns and Thunder Wave paralyzes. Now, grassy terrain, that doesn't sound too competitive, does it? Oh. On the contrary, grassy terrain is why I think these terrain effects were engineered to be answers to previous competitive metas. Because you see, I've been withholding some information from you. Grassy terrain doesn't just boost grass moves and heals everyone. It halves the damage done by Bulldoze, Magnitude, and Earthquake. Why would they sneak this in? It doesn't reduce all ground type moves, not even all the spread ground type moves. It's just the ground moves that damage every opponent and your partner. But why? So I looked up the teams of the top VGC players in the previous generation, and turns out Earthquake was a reliable spread move in the doubles format. So grassy terrain could theoretically protect you from these moves and strike back at ground types with a strong grass move. Yippee! And turns out, the official Pokemon website has recorded the movesets of the top VGC teams from the World Championships starting from this generation, so we can see firsthand how popular terrains were. No results? Well, maybe it took a year for people to... Still no terrains. What about after they allowed Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire Pokemon? No one's using terrains. But wait, there's also other divisions. How about no one's using terrains? Why aren't people using terrains? Is Earthquake not a threat? Is no one running Earthquake? No, people are still running Earthquake. And people are still running status conditions. Hold up, can grass protect you from earthquakes? While the new additions in Generation 6, like the Fairy type and Mega Evolution, were widely used in the competitive scene, the newly introduced terrains had almost no use at all. I mean, most of the examples I've shown so far aren't actually from the 6th generation. But before moving on, I should really think about why this mechanic wasn't popular. People liked weather. What's wrong with terrains? Accessibility. But many Pokemon can learn how to set the terrain up. There's the issue right there. It's hard to find comments about the weather in Generation 2, but I can at least tell you anecdotally that I only felt the presence of the weather mechanic in the following generation, where the weather was in the overworld and how the big Pokemon on the boxes triggered the weathers upon entry. While for the terrains in Gen 6, it was hard to come across them as they don't happen naturally in the overworld and only a few NPCs use those moves. And honestly, how many times have you skipped learning a status move in the game? Most players would focus on the offense because the game allows you to overlevel and plow through the gyms with just one Pokemon spamming the same move. Why waste a move slot on a status move? And for the competitive side, where the status moves are highly valuable, so are turns. And if you need to spend a turn setting up a condition that will benefit not just you but also your opponent, why not use a move that just buffs your own side? Weather strats were popular mostly due to how other Pokemon got weather setting abilities, where they can immediately and reliably set the condition upon entry. Before anyone takes terrains just as seriously, this mechanic needs to be simply more accessible. which would be done in the following generation. There's a lot of parallels between weather and terrain, not only how they work in the game, but also their history, because the generation after their introduction would add a new member to the group and have legendaries with abilities that trigger the condition upon entry. Let's go! The 4 guardian deities of Alola are all fairy types, but they got different primary types which correspond to a different terrain, except for Tapu Fini who sets a misty terrain. While these weren't the box legendaries, they still played a role in the story, and if you wanted to catch them after the main campaign, you would experience the effects of the terrains firsthand. Now, unlike Gen 3 where the whole personality of the story and legendaries were tied to the weather mechanic, Sun and Moon weren't all about terrains, and yeah, none of the world championships really ran terrain moves, but as the Tapus were allowed in the first Worlds tournament of that generation, we finally got to see terrains go up in competitive matches. In addition to Pokemon that set the terrain, there are also a few new abilities and moves that directly benefited from terrain. I mean, this was also the case in the previous generation, but now there are Pokemon that can reliably set the terrain up, so you can pair these Pokemon together on a team, at least in theory. And to further encourage building teams around terrains, a new item was introduced which gave a defensive boost when a specific terrain becomes active, regardless of if the Pokemon is touching the ground or not. Wait, I haven't even explained this new terrain yet. Psychic Terrain. It boosts Psychic moves for 50%, making Mystery Terrain the only terrain that doesn't boost the type's damage, but every grounded Pokemon would be protected from, drumroll please, plus priority moves. The heck are those? So yeah, priority was a thing since the very first games, where your quick attack would always go first even if you have a lower speed stand, because the move order in the games firstly considered the priorities before looking at the speed stats within the same priority bracket. So in Psychic Terrain, any moves targeting you from your opponent that has a higher priority than the base 0 would fail. Why priority moves all of a sudden, when the other terrains heal and prevent status conditions? Now looking into competitive, kinda makes these make sense again. Despite its low power, the move Fake Out is very valuable in a double setting, because it has priority and flinches one of the 2 opponents for the turn, effectively shutting down their move. But under Psychic Terrain, Fake Out would now fail. Sucker Punch is another strong priority move that connects if the target was attacking that turn. If the floor is covered in Wurmple, Sucker Punch, which is normally super effective against Psychic types, would fail to work. And in addition to all of these moves, a strong supporting ability from the 5th generation was Prankster, which added 1 priority to all status moves. So while moves like Trick Room would still have a -6 priority, moves like Thunder Wave would have a +1 priority, which makes it go before anyone else gets to move. With Psychic Terrain, those Prankster powered Thunder Waves would be blocked as well. But there's an important nuance to Psychic Terrain here, where it only blocks priority moves that travel across the battlefield. So support from a partner like Helping Hand, or field setting moves with priority could still work. Still, priority moves must have been super popular because 2 new Pokemon in this generation had signature abilities that always block incoming priority moves. But yeah, now we got the 4 terrains which are reflected in the legendaries, and while the Tapus were used quite regularly in the tournaments, it doesn't feel like we have terrain-based teams quite yet, like how we used to see sand teams or rain teams. So what's missing? Most of these terrains emphasize a specific type, like the weather, and now we've got Pokemon that can set the terrain upon entry. Heck, we've even got these new seed items that protect partners in a specific terrain. We've got the Pokemon, but maybe we need specific moves, like how certain moves were buffed in the weather. And this next generation would provide some moves that would catapult this mechanic where we could regularly come across it in the game. And yes, I mean the game, not just competitive. Pokemon Sword and Shield had many controversies with their art direction and animations, which were scrutinized due to how animations were named to be the reason of why you can't bring some of your past Pokemon into this game. However, during this controversy, when it came to the game mechanics, Pokemon Sword and Shield's competitive scene felt like one of the most advertised and accessible. The main advertised gimmick was the Dynamax phenomenon, where for 3 turns, you could turn one of your Pokemon into a giant, to not only deal extra damage, but also buff your team, debuff your enemies, or set a condition for everyone. Aha! Remember how casual players wouldn't want to waste the move slot for a status move? Well, worry not, because now you can have similar effects by just attacking. And importantly, while buffing 5 stats or debuffing 5 stats cover 10 out of the 18 types, what do the remaining 8 do? 4 of them set the weather, and 4 set terrains. Heck, it's even worth it to set a terrain when you're Dynamax, because if you're grounded, that terrain would power up your next Dynamax attack. Again, except for mystery terrains, but hey, you'll be protecting your mons from status conditions, which are still popular and competitive. But no longer are terrains this niche mechanic you rarely see in the game, as chances are you would see one in the very first gym. Suddenly, you're expected to learn what these terrains do, and it could be painful if you realize that some of your moves fail due to a terrain, but you'll eventually learn, right? On a quick side note, we've seen that these terrain effects are harder to intuit and understand than the weather effects, which unfortunately means that terrains would confuse a lot of players to this day. While certain actions tell you that the effect was blocked by the terrain, stuff like Grassy Terrain's Earthquake debuff is only felt if you're paying attention to the health bars, and it doesn't help that the description leaves this out as well. But whether you understand this or not, terrains are harder to avoid in a game, as some of them even happen in the overworld now. And furthermore, there are 2 major additions to this generation that greatly boost the presence of terrains, with new Pokemon and new moves. Grass, Electric, Psychic, and Misty. Long ago in 2020, 4 new Pokemon would get hidden abilities that set terrain upon entry. But everything would change when the gorilla attacked. So yeah, on top of the Tapus, which were eventually available in these games, 4 new non-legendary Pokemon gained Surge abilities, where one of them was a partner Pokemon. Alright, so while terrains enjoyed a lot of these additions, they were also nerfed a little, where the damage buff they gave out is now only 30%, but this was still enough for this grass-type Primate to go ham, because on top of setting the terrain, they got access to a special move. See, this was the first generation where Pokemon did DLCs instead of new versions of the game, and to make the DLCs more enticing, why not introduce some new moves? So there was at least 1 new move for each type, and the 4 terrain-related types all got moves that depended on their respective terrains. Firstly, Grassy Glide did a little less than average damage, but in grassy terrain, they would gain a priority. Compared to other moves with priorities, this is actually pretty strong, and what's that? It's a grass move, so the damage would be further boosted by the terrain. This is what made Rillaboom such a strong pick even amongst legendaries, and it could quickly deal some non-negligible damage. A way to counter the move is to change the terrain, but as it became harder to do so in the following generation, which doesn't have Dynamax, this move's power would get nerfed twice in the future. Alright, then we got Rising Voltage, which doubles in power if your target is touching electric terrain. That's a lot of damage. But there's more! If you're also touching electric terrain, well, it's an electric type move, so you get boosted by 30% more. So this is dishing out some pure offense. Not as fancy as Grassy Glide, which lets you forego speed tiers, but let me briefly talk about the new electric terrain setter here, Pincurchin, the Pincushion Urchin. So, this guy is characteristically slow, and they kinda remind me of Torkoal, who is the more popular Sunsetter amongst the non-legend and Mega Pokemon. They're slow, but pretty bulky, and their middling offense is still enough for them to hit strong eruptions under the sun, under Trick Room, where the slowest Pokemon actually get to go first. Comparatively, Pincurchin here is a lot less healthy. Sure, it's only weak to ground types, but the poor guy can barely survive before doing much. While the Tapus didn't get access to these new moves, people would rather use Rising Voltage on other electric Pokemon like Regieleki, who can set their own electric terrain through Dynamax. But then we got Misty Explosion, which has a power of 100! That's the highest number we've got so far. And this move in particular gets boosted in Misty terrain by 50%. But it's an explosion move, which means that the user faints upon using it. So, compared to other explosion moves, which both have higher power, yeah, this seems a lot worse. I guess the difference here is that it's a fairy type instead of normal, and it's a special move instead of physical. I don't know. The new Misty Terrain setter of this generation is Galarian Wheezing, but many players found another ability of theirs much more interesting, namely Neutralizing Gas, which shuts down everyone else's abilities. So it became even harder to see a Galarian Wheezing set Misty Terrain, as Tapu Fini would still be quite popular when they were allowed. But yeah, Misty Explosion was kinda outshined by the other moves, especially by this last one, Expanding Force, which deals 80 damage, but in Psychic Terrain, it gets a 50% boost. But hold on, it's a Psychic move, so it gets a further 30% boost due to the Psychic Terrain. And on top of all this, with Psychic Terrain, Expanding Force doesn't hit just the target, but also the target's partner. Now, did you know that every spread move in Pokemon has a 25% debuff than if you were hitting just one target? I don't know if the game ever mentions this, but yeah, this is a mechanic that applies in double battles, which is the official format. But comparing this to Misty Explosion, which is also a spread move, Expanding Force is straight up better. And the move would be well used by this generation's Psychic Terrain setter, Indeedee, who came in two forms, which has slightly different stats and different move pools. Of the two forms, female Indeedee got more popular due to having access to certain support moves, as she was able to stand amongst gods. So the surge abilities and extra moves really helped these Pokemon have a competitive identity. But yeah, Terrains have had very humble beginnings, where they were barely noticed in the story and in competitive. But now, Terrains are everywhere, almost as much as Weathers are. But what if Terrains are getting a bit too out of hand? In Scarlet and Violet, there weren't as many changes to the terrain mechanic. By now, maybe it received a bit too much love. All the additions from the previous generation, with the strong moves and the Pokemon that could set the terrain, all of it was under the generation of Dynamax, where any Dynamax Pokemon with a certain kind of move can overwrite the current terrain. Now that Dynamax is gone, terrains are generally harder to get rid of. Pokemon must have expected this because they had moves that removed terrain, but while weather Pokemon have several viable weather setters to rain on each other's parade, this game didn't have the Tapus, so we only have the 4 terrain setters from the previous generation. Oh wait, there's actually a new Pokemon with a terrain setting ability here. I believe a Seed Sower applies grassy terrain upon getting hit. Now, despite this, Rillaboom is still the more popular choice, as they can immediately set the terrain and can deal massive damage. And Indeedee do have various partners who can take advantage of their psychic terrain. We're finally seeing terrain-based teams! Hooray! Wait, this is actually pretty annoying to deal with. Oh no, is it too strong? The psychic terrain teams were often paired with Torkoal, who can set the sun. So if the opponent resists psychic moves, the team can easily shift into sun mode and use fire moves, as the two effects don't override each other. While one might have answers to weather teams, or even find ways to block psychic terrain, a team would rarely have an answer to both. And heck, Torkoal can even go on the offense if Indeedee is able to pull off a Trick Room. But hold on there. There's a major addition to terrains that I've been glossing over, because before I talk about the competitive implications, I need to talk about the story. Pokemon is fully embracing terrains as a parallel to weather here, as a Paz-flavored Winged King of the Scarlet version sets up sunny weather upon entry, and the futuristic Iron Serpent of the Violet version sets up electric terrain. Both can coexist with their respective conditions, as they also further boost their relevant offensive stat, and also the highest stat of other fellow Paradox Pokemon. The Scarlet Pass Paradox Pokemon are powered by harsh sunlight, and the animatronic characters do get a bit quirky in electric terrain. You could at least see Koraidon or Miraidon apply these effects when you finally get to face them. So yeah, having this special set of Paradox Pokemon get boosted in the presence of their leader made me think that maybe these Paradoxes were meant to work together. But in practice, I haven't seen many teams rely on the weather or terrain to power up their Paradox Mons, as they would rather use the consumable item that came with the Paradoxes. However, between the sun-setting Koraidon and the electric terrain Miraidon, the terrain setter actually seems to be more popular, especially due to their signature move. Both legendaries get a 100 base power move that share a type with the species, and while it deals more damage to Pokemon that are weak to the type, that overkill isn't necessary for Miraidon, because while Koraidon's signature move is a fighting type, which doesn't get boosted by the weather, Miraidon's is electric, and Miraidon says electric terrain. Uh-oh, there's a 30% boost now. And given the monstrous special attack Miraidon had, especially with their stat boost from their ability, Miraidon can KO many Pokemon that resist the electric type, just through sheer power alone. With Rillaboom and Indeedee, the only terrain I don't see often nowadays is Misty terrain. But we finally got to see some terrain-based teams this generation. But at what cost? This is when I would talk about how other games of the genre dealt with this kind of a mechanic. But I must say, while I saw many other creature collectors with weather conditions in and out of battle, it's harder to find battle mechanics that are specifically analogous to terrain. Now, terrains aren't an exclusive thing to Pokemon. Story-based RPGs, both old and new, often have terrains in the overworld that make it a challenge to traverse. But what about games with turn-based combat? Well, apparently Yu-Gi-Oh! Has field spell cards, which emphasize a type and sometimes have other effects. While I'm not too well versed in this franchise, I can recognize that these are supporting cards that tilt the game towards certain builds. But I think we're missing the big picture here, as these field effects are comparable to Pokemon's terrain as much as they are with Pokemon's weather effect. Nah, when I say I'm looking for mechanics that are like Pokemon's terrain, the important part wasn't about the effects being on the floor, nor was it about applying an effect in the battlefield, because Pokemon's weather does that as well. It's about how Pokemon has two of these systems that can happen simultaneously. Like there's a field effect of Pokemon's weather and a field effect of Pokemon's terrain, without replacing each other. For the games with weather or field systems, having one warring mechanic seemed plenty already. So I can understand why there aren't weather and terrains in other games. So with this in mind, let me briefly talk about my plans before showing off another creature today. In Stemma, my collection of stem-based creatures, I already talked about how I want weather conditions, especially due to my face-changing Stemma. And frankly, while I put a lot of thought into the weather system, I was less sure about having another set of warring field conditions. Now, I have concepts about having an electromagnetic field and a gravitational field, but why would they override each other? Our very own world has both going on at the same time right now. Now, while I did code in categories like airborne and aquatic stemma, it would take some time before I really sit down and balance EMAG and gravity fields, because while they are separate effects, I would love to have some semblance of symmetry between them. Speaking of symmetry, in my weather video last year, I went over my plans of implementing 3 weathers, which collectively affect Pyro, Hydro, and Cryostemma. User Zero Crows commented how I should have the weathers only affect Cryo's defenses, which I agree with, as having that kind of symmetry might make it easier to remember these effects. My only issue now is how Hydro and Cryo species are being affected directly by the weather, while only Pyro moves are affected by the weather. Part of me wants to change that, but I don't know. These effects can be changed in the future anyways. Changing them into code shouldn't be a hassle. But before I close out this video, allow me to show you another Zodiac beast. So yeah, these are designs from years ago when I had plans to have a special story chapter, which I'm currently not planning on having in my base game because I'm not even done with the starting area. I need to reduce my scope. But the idea behind these guys were that they were loosely based off of the Zodiac symbols. But in reality, they're just based off of niche STEM topics. Like today's creature is based off of Taurus. According to the horoscope, if you're a Taurus, you will have a nice day today. So the concept is based off of a visually inspiring display of engineering called kinetic sculptures, constructions that move, because kinetic means moving. Dutch artist and engineer Theo Janssen is known for his kinetic sculptures that walk across the land. Sculptures that are called strong beasts, who are powered just by the wind. So how are these pipes and joints walking? So the legs are made out of mechanical linkages, so this shape specifically has been named after Janssen. But yeah, linkages are a system of levers that can be used for various motions, such as extending an arm or linking a piston to a crank. So here is Strarus, where I didn't like what I drew a few years ago, so I actually went ahead and redrew them. I guess I was inspired by the sandy environment in Dune, despite never seeing any of the movies or books, but yeah, there's a big beast to walk across the sandy terrain who's rumored to have smaller beings inside it. Now, being part arrow means that they won't be grounded, but I don't know. I'm not coding this guy into my game yet, and even then, I don't intend on having ground exclusive field effects like Pokemon. If you want to learn more, as always, remember to look in the description where I'll link more related videos, as Janssen actually has his own YouTube channel. Type-themed effects are exciting. There's a reason why people like to think of a weather for every type, or even a terrain for every type. Terrains were a way to give spotlight to certain types while also trying to actively provide counters to the previous meta. Pokemon has been going on for more than 2 decades, and they've been making additions to make their games more interesting, even if most of that is usually realized by the deeper competitive fans. But with that context, it makes sense why other games of the genre would stick to just one system of warring conditions, as there's no need to come out the gates with an overly complicated system, when you could provide death in other places. If you like this video, or if you're interested in seeing my project's progression, you can follow the channel. A special thank you to all my Patreon patrons for directly supporting my work. Most of my progress on the project has been trying to tweak the main gameplay loop, which I've been actively avoiding to show in my videos, but I do try to provide very short updates every week to my highest Patreon tier. But you can always support me for free by just liking and sharing this video. Alright, thank you so much for watching till the end. And Tauros or not, I hope the winds help you keep moving forward.